Welcome everybody to today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Protecting the Grid, Reducing Risks to the Nation's Energy Network. It's brought to you by NCSL's Energy Program. My name is Glenn Anderson. I'm the Energy Program Director here at NCSL, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. The webinar will focus on how states can better assess the risks, improve resiliency, and protect energy infrastructure from a growing number of natural and man-made threats. I'll mention that the DOE has a long history of collaboration with NCSL to increase legislative understanding of energy assurance and resiliency issues, since the energy system failures and disruptions posed by these failures create a serious threat to economic health and human welfare in many states. The Department of Energy is now embarking on a new effort to improve the state's ability to quantify risks, consequences, and vulnerabilities so that decision makers can ensure more effective responses and accelerate recovery from energy disruptions. So before I begin, I just wanted to mention that our two presenters will be answering questions after their presentations, and please type your questions in the question box on the right side of your screen at any time during the webinar, and we will answer them after both the presenters have presented. We are also very interested in hearing comments on what type of information you as policymakers may need to better assess and address threats to the energy system in your state, and the type of assistance that DOE may be able to provide, or NCSL as well. The presentation slides will be posted, as will the recorded webinar, quite soon after the conclusion of the webinar, and we will send out a notice notifying you of the location of these resources. So first, I'd like to introduce Alice Lippert. We're very fortunate to have her on the line today. She has over 30 years in federal service and currently serves as the Senior Technical Advisor to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Energy Infrastructure Modeling and Analysis, also known as IMA, with the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability. She was formerly the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for IMA. Ms. Lippert specializes in energy infrastructure risk and reliability analysis and has over 25 years dealing with energy supply disruptions and emergency response events. She is a resident senior expert on domestic energy markets, critical infrastructure, and energy supply trends. So let's welcome Alice Lippert.
Well, thank you, Glenn. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to participate on the webinar. I'm going to focus my remarks on an initiative we have going on here within my office. And this initiative is a state risk assessment initiative, and we've kicked this off with our major state associations this past summer. So can I get the slide, please? Are we having technical problems here? I'm not seeing any slides.
My apologies. We have the State Energy Risk Assessment Working Group slide up right now.
Okay, so I can't see it, so I'm just going to go ahead and start talking, and then I'll just tell you next slide, all right?
Thank you.
So, all right, thank you, Jocelyn. Sorry, everybody. So, as I mentioned, this past summer, my office provided funds to 4 national state associations to begin to look at how state agencies and legislative bodies assess risk. And this can be when responding to an event or making policy decisions. And those 4 major associations are, of course, NCSL, the National Association of State Energy Officials, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and the National Governors Association. And these 4 groups have formed a working group to collaborate and promote a greater understanding of risk and how risk can be applied to energy systems and infrastructure at the state level. And if you have an understanding of risk, it can improve your overall understanding of what energy assets are critical, and it can provide information about those interdependencies of these assets. So understanding risk is useful in gaining insight about energy systems and, of course, reducing uncertainty. And, of course, all of this relates to information sharing among state, federal governments, the private sector, and the public, which can overall, when you share information and you're aware of it, it reduces your risk. So if you know your energy profile and you know how to assess risk to energy systems, this in the long run, as I stated, can reduce uncertainty and lead to improved planning and response when an event happens. So the group has chosen to address some major activities or objectives. And the group's going to focus on determining what those state energy risk needs are. They want to look at current practices at the state level on how state agencies assess risk or analyze risk. They want to identify tools and methods and processes to evaluate risk related to energy systems and assets. And then, of course, after this is all taking place, they want to share this with key stakeholders because, as I mentioned, you know, enhancing information sharing and collaboration is really important. Next slide, please. So I threw this slide in because I wanted to talk about risk and how we look at risk here at the department, and I think everybody sort of treats all these components the same when we're dealing with risk. And so this is just a high level, a quick look at this. Jeff's going to get into, Jeff Pillen, who's going to follow me, will get into more detail in his presentation on this. But for starters, risk involves what? Well, it's understanding your threat and or your hazards. So, you know, what are the conditions that can impact, or what are some threats that can impact your energy systems? And then we deal with vulnerabilities. And these are, you know, how vulnerable are energy systems or assets to threats and hazards. And then the third component is consequence. So if you have an impact, if you have some damage or loss to a system or an asset, you know, what does that mean to the system, to the energy system, to the energy market overall? Or does it have some economic consequences, some impacts, some public safety, even social to some degree? And then there's a fourth piece to this, and it's called criticality. And all that is, you know, once you understand your risk, then you can identify those systems, those assets, those networks, whatever they are in that supply chain that are critical for energy supply continuity. So that's just sort of a high-level look at what, when I talk about risk, these are the things that I'm talking about. Next slide. So I mentioned the group has these activities, and as this activity matures, they have some goals that they're going to try to accomplish within the next, 6 months to a year. And the goals are to make states more aware of risk as it relates to energy systems and infrastructure. And these goals, or this activity, is to help them make more informed decisions and to have state agencies and legislators like yourself make more informed decisions. And the group wants to inform and assist states on the kind of capabilities and resources that are out there for identifying and evaluating risks. And then, of course, at the end, provide a kind of toolkit that contains a resource list or a list of methods, tools, models, processes, anything that will allow you to do your jobs better, that helps you, make decisions in a more informed way. Next slide. So the initiative has a sort of set of overall benefits, and The benefits are, really to increase or improve awareness, but create a risk management culture. It also can be, promote better decision making, and which leads to better investments. Because if you know your risk, then you can make better decisions about your planning processes or mitigation decisions that are made for, a variety of areas. Next slide. So I want to highlight a number of activities we've conducted since we began this initiative. We just started this in September, by the way. So these organizations have gotten their funding. But we've been pretty busy. In early October, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners has conducted a utility investment simulation exercise, and participants were presented with a set of scenarios and asked to come up with a set of investment decisions. And we had to do this, we played this game and we had to do it quickly. And it's kind of interesting about, the types of decisions people made and how they would go about doing that. And then on early October as well, we held the Winter Energy Outlook Conference, which was here in Washington, D.C. And NASIO was a sponsor of that. And I would encourage you to go to NASIO's website because the presentations from that Winter Energy Outlook Conference are posted there. And this conference was all about what to expect for the upcoming heating season. And we know that last year was a very, very cold winter. There were impacts to the energy systems of all kinds, particularly in the propane area. So we had a session on propane at the Outlook Conference. So anyway, I would just encourage you to go and take a look if you have time at some of those presentations because they are very useful. And then, of course, NASIO and NCSL are hosting webinars like this one, so those kind of activities will be ongoing. And then we are scheduling a energy risk assessment workshop in spring of 2015. So here's where we want to display the types of tools that will be in the toolkit or this resource list that I mentioned. So stay tuned for that. We'll be coordinating with NCSL. NCSL will be a sponsor of this event. And we haven't nailed down any of the details, but hopefully we can do that shortly and get that out to everybody. So these are some of the things we've conducted, and we've also produced a strategy on this initiative, and we're getting ready to send this to the membership after we get it printed, so stay tuned for that as well. So now I'm going to turn over the presentation to Jeff, and Jeff's going to get into more details about risk, its importance, and applications of risk. So thank you all so much, and as Glenn said, we'll take questions after both presentations.
Thanks, Alice. Let me just quickly introduce Jeff and give a little background there, and I'll mention that we will send out links to the NASIO Winter Energy Outlook Conference that Alice just mentioned, so you won't have to look those up. We'll send that out in the details with the links to this webinar. So Jeff Pillen is from the National Association of State Energy Officials, and he is the Director of Energy Assurance there. He has lectured nationally on energy assurance planning and preparedness, and designed and assisted in conducting a series of multi-state regional energy emergency exercises and after-action workshops. Mr. Pillen worked for the state of Michigan from 1973 to 2009. During this time, he was manager of energy data and security at the Michigan Public Service Commission and was responsible for monitoring energy supply and demand, short-term energy forecasting, emergency preparedness, and management of the Commission's website and information technology applications. So let me welcome Jeff Pillen. First, I'll just add again that please enter your questions at any time in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have questions for Jeff or Alice, and we will be able to address those at the end of the webinar. Thank you. Welcome, Jeff. Just one moment, we may have lost audio for Jeff. 1 second and we will get him on the line.
All right, I am now on the line. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Glenn, for inviting me to participate in this, and I hope you'll find this informative. As I was saying, this is a joint effort, as Alice had already mentioned, with the NGA, NCSL, NARUC, and NASIO working together with the Department of Energy to develop these concepts and to share them with our members to overall improve our capabilities to address the issue of risk. A lot of this work really stems and flows from the work that's been done under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, which was originally issued back in 2009. It's been updated a couple of times. The current version was released in 2013, and I would just direct you to a couple of these statements in the missions and goals where it talks about managing physical and cyber risks through an integrated effort in looking at the nation's critical infrastructure. And there's the goals that talks about assessing and analyzing threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences to make risk-informed management activities, and to share actionable and relevant information across the infrastructure community to build awareness and enable risk-informed decision-making. So these are very fundamental aspects of the NIPP, and a lot of our work is tried to be conducted within its framework. As Alice has mentioned also, we're looking at risk as a function of threats and hazards, vulnerability, and consequences. And as you can see in this figure on the right-hand side, we look at those elements in terms of how they function across the various components of the National Preparedness mission area to prevent, protect, mitigate, respond, and recover. And that really what we're talking about is a continuous process that will evolve over time. The issue of threats and hazards is important because it sets up for you and allows you to examine where you may have vulnerabilities to various types of scenarios. But we're really kind of focusing this effort even more on the area of vulnerability, where we can find weak links in the energy supply chain, areas where we may have antiquated or old equipment that's prone to failure. Some of you may have heard about the power outage that occurred in Detroit this week that was a result of a failed cable because of the underinvestment that's occurred in the Detroit public lighting. And they have been somewhat frequent in recent years because of that underinvestment. And those power outages do have a considerable economic cost associated with them. They close down schools and businesses and send people home for the day, and it really has an impact. Another aspect of looking at vulnerability is the interdependency effects and how different sectors can be impacted as these cascading events occur. And so we need to look at interdependencies as a component of that. And most important, to really look at the consequences to understand what are the impacts on both public health and safety and the economic impacts to society, which can be very large. Now, an awful lot of work has already been done on threats and hazards, so we're not reinventing anything. We're really just tapping into the existing resource base. Most states prepare hazard analysis that documents historical events in the states. As part of our energy assurance planning efforts, states were to develop an energy supply disruption tracking process to monitor events when they occurred and track the road to recovery. Most state energy assurance plans, but not all, do contain some assessments of risk of energy disruptions. You may or may not have seen these plans because some are not public and considered for official use only, because they really are talking about risk and potential vulnerabilities, not something that necessarily belongs in the public domain. Many states have created state fusion centers, another source for threat information, and some have a critical infrastructure protection desk, and there's regular reports that are circulated to public and private sector partners, things like suspicious activity reports and so forth. The Department of Energy, for example, maintains information on power outages through the OE 417 reports, and that information on the number of customer outages by utility is available on the DOE website, and you can actually go in and for utilities in your state, by month and by year, there's a good record of when outages have occurred, so you can look at the frequency and probability of things that have occurred. And finally, the FEMA website has all the major disaster declarations, and those are always based on economic impacts of the event. So again, another source of information that really well fleshes out, I think, this component of the risk analysis. Vulnerabilities and criticality are also very important components, as Alice mentioned. And what we're really talking about is, you know, there's some things that are very visible. You can't hide a nuclear power plant very easily. In fact, this is a picture of the Fermi nuclear power plant that I took taking off from the Detroit Metropolitan Airport, because you fly right over top of it. But some facilities are really not well known. Control centers, for instance. City gate controls for the natural gas system, things of that sort. Vulnerabilities do relate to whether or not you have inherent redundancy and resiliency. How much security do you have? Can you recover quickly? Do you have cybersecurity in place? You know, so if you have a lot of these things in place, your vulnerability should decline. On the criticalities of the equation, you're looking at what's really important. What is the level of interdependencies? If one thing goes down, like the power grid, almost everything tends to stop at this point. So there's a major cascading impact. What is the relative importance of things? Some things are clearly more important than others. And typically you want to base that on consequence and impacts and potential threats to public safety. So that while nuclear power plants are very heavily protected, they do have a very high consequence in terms of the threat to public safety if you did have a breach like we saw with the Fukushima reactor in Japan. In looking at consequences, we really need to look at things that are both direct and indirect effects, not only the physical loss of the facility, but also the loss of revenue. It might have interfered with the production in another industry. It might have shut down production in other areas. So you want to look at all those effects. You want to look at the price spikes that occur and how that impacts consumers and businesses. You have to take a look at how that affects discretionary spending, because now if you're spending a lot more for energy, you're not buying other goods and services that are more because you're spending more money on energy. In fact, we've got the converse occurring today. With the significant drop in gasoline prices, it's really freed up a lot of disposable income, and people seem to be spending in preparation for Christmas, which is obviously stimulating the economy. So there's a lot of interaction that you have to look at as you consider these things. From a national level, you know, you really want to look at human impacts, fatalities, and injuries. As I said, primary and secondary economic impacts, impacts on public confidence and the ability of government to function and assure its mission. So here's an example of the three components if we look at it from a cybersecurity perspective. So first, under consequence, you're looking at things like loss of revenue, public safety effects, decline in maybe the stock value of a company. Certainly we've seen these data breaches have had very significant financial impacts for companies, and the cost of remediating those loss of customer information can be extremely expensive, and you can cause operational interdependencies. The types of things that are exploited for these types of events are things like zero-day vulnerability exploits, things in software programs that have vulnerabilities inherent with them that have not yet been discovered and therefore can be exploited. theft of information. People predominantly hack into systems because they want to steal things that are of value. Oftentimes that's done using social or human engineering as a vehicle to get people to give up information that allows them to then access the system. So a lot of things can be potentially exploited to impact the system. And then in terms of the threat components, a variety of things, certainly viruses and worms, malicious actors, user errors, equipment failures, but then you have the full range of natural hazards that can also affect the telecommunication infrastructure. If a major switching station or a data center gets flooded or loses power or can't sustain backup power, then you're going to be losing that facility. Alice mentioned interdependencies, and this goes back to a workshop we did a year ago now, and this was one of 4 scenarios that we looked at, and we explored how a long-term drought would impact across various sectors. And you don't really quite think about how some of these things can work, but take, for example, in a long-term drought with electricity, if you don't have adequate cooling water to continue to run a power plant, you will have to curtail production from that plant. And in some of the droughts that we saw in the southeast a few years ago, that actually began to occur. You need water for production of oil and gas, and that can reduce the production. If you don't have sufficient water, you may see a reduction in the corn crop, and if you have a reduction in the corn crop, is that going to impact ethanol production, which is now required literally in every gallon of gasoline we produce in the country. So there's all these interactions that in order to analyze these things properly, you need to really have a better handle and understand them. So why are we doing this? And the simple reason is because of the enormous cost that you see from these kinds of events. If you take a look at just weather-related power outages, they've cost the U.S. economy an average of $18 to $33 billion. Since 1980, 144 weather disasters with damage costs exceeding $1 billion. You take a look at things like Hurricane Ike, cost estimates 40 to 75 billion. Superstorm Sandy, 27 to 52 billion. I mean, look at, even Hurricane Katrina, $75 billion and 1,200 people died. And the cost of rebuilding the levees in New Orleans alone has been $14 billion to date. Just on an everyday basis, the Electric Power Research Institute estimates that the cost of power outages across all business sectors at between $104 billion and $64 billion a year. So if we can make investments that build resiliency and can withstand attacks from Mother Nature and other events that disrupt our energy supplies, we can potentially, have some significant cost savings from those investments. There's been some estimates that suggest that just even that the cost of building a more resilient infrastructure is considerably less than the cost of replacing the damage that can result from these threats. So Alice mentioned about our project, and we've continued to develop information and compile information. We're trying to look at the various approaches that are already out there and available. We're trying to identify models and methods that states can use and have used, but to improve on them in some ways, to augment them based on existing research and data that's available, so they can advance their knowledge of how these risks can be mitigated and what are the policies, programs, and other initiatives that can be used to build a more resilient infrastructure. At the end of the day, we hope to have a toolbox with different methods, and I think for the legislative folks, the real issue is what kind of information might be of greatest value to you as policymakers that the executive branch can potentially bring forward that helps you make more informed risk-based decisions. And that's really part of what we're looking for. It's not just the methods, but what kind of information is most helpful in that decision-making process as well. So we have convened this risk analysis state working group. We have an excellent group of individuals from across the country that have been engaged in this work for a number of years. We have, I believe, 19 states currently participating in our working group. We just had our first organizational conference call with them and began to scope out what their thoughts were as to how to best proceed. And we're going to try to have some interim results for that April workshop that Alice mentioned earlier. One of the early things we did, which again Alice mentioned, was we had this exercise on October 6th that we ran with the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners that looked at decision making, and if you made investments of X, Y, and Z and it cost this amount of money, then when you were confronted with a scenario, you could take a look at how well those investment decisions you made help contribute to your ability to respond to those given set of events. And so it was an interesting discussion and an interesting approach on the decision-making side of the equation. One of the models that is currently in place, and virtually every state has participated in this, is the National Critical Infrastructure Prioritization Program run by the Department of Homeland Security. They've set up a level 1 and level 2 thresholds for facilities, economic consequences, mass evacuation, and national security. And you can look at any given critical infrastructure to see whether or not, under a worst-case scenario, it would meet these threshold levels to be considered as something for inclusion in the National Asset Database. And every state has gone through that exercise to some measure. The information is not in the public domain because it is sensitive in nature, but most of this work has been done by Homeland Security agencies in collaboration with sector-specific agencies that are involved in the various areas. So energy offices and Public Utility Commission in many cases have been involved in assisting those Homeland Security agencies in this analysis. As part of this work, they also developed a supplemental list that looked at not only just single assets, but nodes that may be critical in a system, where there are a cluster of facilities that are located of a similar type that are right in a single region, and systems. And certainly with energy, we have to take a systems approach because of the nature of how these energy resources are distributed. I mean, with electricity being delivered at the speed of light, we see impacts very instantaneously if there's a major failure. With other things like liquid fuels and petroleum products, we see a more creeping kind of event which begins to build over time, but can become pretty serious, as we saw last winter with the shortages of propane that seriously impacted many Midwestern states as well as some of the Northeast. So we have to look at the whole supply chain when we're looking at these things, and we have to evaluate it because you've got to look for potential vulnerabilities along that supply chain perspective. Another tool that's been used by states under the guidance of the Federal Emergency Management Agency is the Threat and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment. This particular tool does have to begin with some consequence assessment, but it's really designed to look at capabilities to respond to events and the resources that states require to be able to properly and effectively respond and quickly respond, and that's certainly a component of resilience. So THIRA has been used by a number of states and is out there. That analysis has been done. It really begins with two components of the National Preparedness System, which is identifying and assessing risk and estimating the capability requirements based on those risks. So it doesn't lead you to the conclusions about the economic consequences component, but it does give you information on your level of preparedness at a state and whether or not you've adequately resourced the capacity to respond effectively, rapidly, and efficiently. So I mentioned state energy assurance plans earlier, and a number of those plans did include risk assessments. Not all did. Some of them were quantitative in nature, some of them were qualitative in nature. So we saw some different approaches. The key thing to this type of analysis is that it be simple, repeatable, that you can do it regularly for updates, and that it's documented, reproducible, and defensible. And what I thought I'd do next is show you some examples of some of the studies and some key components of those studies that have tried to address risk in a number of states. California used a risk assessment tool, which was really more of a scoring in nature. They had risk identified in categories of natural, technological, human-induced, and terrorism. And then they had an energy supply disruption risk matrix where they could look at the severity of impacts based on a rating factor. And that would be considering probability, levels of physical damage, and so forth. And then the relative risk related to the severity of the impact and the probability. The overall matrix looked, as you'll see in this next slide, where on the energy side you look at the supply disruption event, you would look at the probability ranging from either not applicable, doubtful, possible, probable, inevitable, physical damage cost, again, in categories and buckets, and so forth, social and economic impacts. You know, if the event occurred, estimate the duration of the interruption to the facility and business operation. Is it hours, days, weeks, or months? Because clearly with these kind of events, the longer the disruption, you get almost a geometrical increase in the overall set of consequences. So this is one of the ways in which California tried to get to numerical scoring to look at these different types of scenarios. Oregon did a very interesting earthquake risk study for a critical infrastructure hub that exists along the Columbia River, where there's a fairly high concentration of critical energy infrastructure. And they not only looked at the facilities there in the Columbia River, but they also looked at what happened in other parts of the world when earthquakes hit and how did it impact on the infrastructure. As you see in the lower right-hand corner, the collapsed transmission tower from an earthquake in Chile in 2010. So what can you do to maybe reinforce those towers if they're really critical and key interconnects? They looked and identified a number of transformers that were sitting on concrete pads but weren't actually bolted down. And now they've taken to getting those transformers actually bolted down. And really the goal to this, as you see in the top diagram, is can we improve the ability when a disaster hits to return things to normal conditions rapidly and even ideally have a resulting improvement in overall services, as opposed to you go down and it takes you a long time to recover and get back to normal, and you may not even get back to normal. And if you take a look at New Orleans after Katrina, although much of the city has been rebuilt, there's still areas that are underdeveloped and neighborhoods that have not been rebuilt as yet. This is a map that was developed by the New York State 2100 Commission to look at how they could improve the resiliency of New York State's infrastructure following Sandy. And one of the things they did is they identified the pink areas, which are flood risk areas, and then identified the location of key electrical, gas, and transmission lines that move through those areas that were, prone to flooding. And this will allow them in the longer term to take a look at ways that they can either reinforce those pipes that are potentially, could be exposed, and some were due to erosion from the storm, or reroute them in the longer run if they don't need to run through those areas and so forth. So very interesting study. They did a nice job looking at interdependencies and across sector impacts. Colorado used a composite type score. They used a set of natural hazards, and they had a ranking of them, and they then tried to take a look at a previous occurrence, the geographic extent, the probability, the degree to which the energy sector was impacted, and then they could come up with an overall composite score for a number of their facilities. Michigan did a scoring for prioritization purposes, and it was based on two categories: critical evaluation to look at death, property damage, revenue loss, etc. Priority evaluation looked at visibility, attractiveness score, and whether or not they'd taken countermeasures. And then again, they placed their scoring into these categories. So it was like 50 to 500 deaths or 500 to 5,000, and then there was a weight for each one of these things, and you ended up with an overall score so you could determine the criticality of different facilities, and it resulted in a pretty much a bell-shaped distribution curve. The cybersecurity maturity model has been developed by the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability and DOE, a way to look to see whether or not your cyber systems are mature relative to the overall industry. And you can assess them, again, through these various components. You kind of move through this, and it kind of gives you kind of where you're at in developing an overall security profile from a cybersecurity perspective. And then just even, it's sometimes not models, it's sometimes not scoring, it's sometimes just knowing about what's going on in energy markets and knowing what inventories are, what production from refineries look like, tracking what prices are doing. Right now, U.S. propane stocks are very high, but on the converse side, I probably should have had the slide up here that showed distillate stocks were actually running below the 5-year average, and they're fairly low in some regions of the country. And so that's an area as a result of which we'll need to be watching a little more carefully. So sometimes just descriptive statistics can be an important part of your risk assessment process. And it's one of the reasons we do the Winter Energy Outlook Conference, to kind of take a look at what the experts are saying about the supply outlook. And a year ago, it did reveal that we had some potential threats to propane supplies, and we began to move forward after that conference to begin to prepare to respond to those sorts of events. So some of the key outcomes that we hope to result from this effort is to provide technical assistance to states in the development and use of these tools, to make certain they have the data that they need, to make certain that we can characterize the results in ways that are meaningful to decision makers, and try to make certain that this is a clearly coordinated effort between all of the groups that are involved. NASIO working with NARUC, NGA, and NCSL. We find that certainly when we're singing off the same page, trying to explain these things in a similar manner, it tends to be far more effective in communicating to our collective constituencies. Some of the key product deliverables include this toolbox we hope to put together, better coordination with federal agencies on data sources needed to support state risk assessment, guidance on how to use public and private sector resources, and we'll, at the end of this, once we have compiled the information, we'll be conducting a series of outreach activities, including webinars, workshops, and technical guidance to assist states across the board. I like this quote from Dr. Flynn, and I think he does a very good job of making the point that making upfront investments in safeguards and mitigate risk and consequences far more cost-effective than paying for response and recovery. You take a look at the World Trade Center event and what it's cost. I mean, it's quite astronomical. I mean, they thought sometime after that event it was going to cost between $3 and $4.5 billion to rebuild the site. That number is up closer to $11 billion now. As I mentioned before, we spent $14 billion just rebuilding the levees around New Orleans. So these are enormous costs for government and enormous cost to society. And by making better investments based on a risk awareness understanding of these events, we can make better decisions and hopefully reduce our exposure to future events. And that wraps up my comments for today. Thank you, Glenn, for the time.
All right, thank you so much, Jeff. That was a great presentation. I think really demonstrates the value of this effort and the importance of doing a good risk analysis and its role in helping direct somewhat or often scarce funding to areas where it can be used most effectively and efficiently. Wanted to mention, please, anyone, any of our participants in audience to submit your questions into the question box on the right-hand side of the screen, and comments as well. If there's comments you have regarding the type of information that you may need from this project, we really welcome your questions and comments on this effort. So we do have a question here, and this is for both Alice and Jeff. You know, as policymakers think about these issues, what do you think some of the first steps they should take are, and who should they be contacting first within their states as they are developing an approach or policy to address and assess risks to energy infrastructure in their states?
Well, I'll take a shot at that, Glenn. You know, I think the key from an energy perspective, the key state agencies that are typically involved in this work include public utility commissions, because they have regulatory authority over gas and electric utilities, and they have to provide for the cost recovery of investments that contribute to reliability and resiliency and the adequacy of those supplies. So in states where that remains under a regulated environment, you know, they play an important role. State energy offices will often be involved with some of the liquid fuel issues dealing with gasoline and petroleum products, as well as some of the renewable resources. And so those are another place that I think you would want to determine what kind of activities they had underway. The state energy officers were the recipients of the energy assurance grants, but they had the latitude of parsing those grants out to other agencies that had responsibilities for this work, and that certainly would include making certain that it's closely coordinated with the state's emergency management agency and homeland security activities, because these are all kind of work together hand in hand to achieve these objectives.
This is Alice. I think Jeff stated that very well. The other thing, obviously, is you can contact the Department of Energy. We have lots of information here. It's just depending what it is that that's being done and what kind of information that needs to be addressed. But you know, certainly there are a lot of resources, and you know, obviously the energy offices, the public service commissions or utility commissions. Jeff mentioned EMAs or Homeland Security offices, because they have done some of the work that may be of interest to legislators with respect to looking at those components of risk. The other one is sometimes it's useful just to understand your energy profile for your state. And EIA is a really good source. The Energy Information Administration, which is eia.doe.gov, has a list of all these states and their profiles. And we here in my office are also planning to produce state risk profiles for states. And that should be available, I would say, within the next 4 or 5 months. To get those profiles out, and that will highlight, you know, what are the hazards in your state, what's the energy production, you know, the composition of energy in your state, you know, anywhere along that whole supply chain, and that'll deal with, you know, natural gas, electricity, and petroleum, and to a lesser extent some of the other like renewables and coal.
Thanks, Alice. We have another question here. Is there sometimes challenges with after, say, developing a risk analysis and proceeding to have some plans for increasing, say, resiliency, and those have some costs? Has there been some resistance to that, especially if those costs might be borne by utilities? And how are these challenges overcome?
Well, with regards to utilities, the issue of cost recovery, I don't think has been terribly problematic. The costs fall into 2 categories. One of the categories is there are certain standards that have now been adopted For example, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation has mandatory critical infrastructure protection standards involving cybersecurity, and utilities must comply with those standards. So it's a regulatory compliance cost, and most states certainly recognize the importance of allowing recovery of those legitimate costs as long as they're within the framework of what's been required. And they can be considerable. One number I think I saw was the increased security requirements for nuclear power plants was probably something in excess of $337 million nationally, and it was probably larger than that, that was added to electricity rates to just meet the new NRC requirements after 9/11. I think that there's an understanding that these things have to be addressed. Now, there are some cases where some utilities might have taken the view that they wanted to ask for additional monies for doing work that may be beyond the level of risk that may have been warranted, and so those have to be adjudicated and shown that they're prudent and useful. Some of the costs that are being borne directly and fully by the private sector, and they kind of do their own risk profile. And the thing here is that under the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, it's really a public-private partnership, and it's important for states to be working with the private sector to understand what they're doing and to coordinate those efforts as best possible.
I think there are a number of challenges, and I tend to agree this is definitely not a simple thing to undertake, because we know we have, particularly in the energy area, there are environmental regulations. You're dealing with situations where you could be operating under tighter margins, or just trying to understand all the components within the sector, all those interdependencies. And so, to some extent, Mother Nature, some of the extreme weather. So I agree that there are a number of challenges. But again, I think that, what Jeff mentioned, it just depends what area. So I'm not really certain. The question was fairly broad, so I don't want to go down a path of providing some detail without having, completely understood. But I definitely agree that there are challenges, and of course all those challenges kind of feed into the analysis you do. So wherever you are and you're trying to assess that risk and trying to make a decision about that investment that's being made, you have to understand the costs and the benefits of that, which definitely are a component of risk.
Thanks. And then we have one final question here, it appears. Again, if any of our audience does have a question, feel free to send that in. This one relates to the Michigan effort and what initiated their risk assessment, and how whether it significantly impacted the steps they took then after it was created to address threats to their energy system.
That particular analysis resulted in us identifying critical components of the infrastructure within the state, and that was across all sectors, but there certainly was an energy sector component to it. And having done that, we learned that there were some things that were really not as important as we thought. There were some things that were a lot more critical than we perhaps were initially aware of, and there was a whole lot of stuff in the middle. Some which tended to kind of distribute, some was high and some was a little bit lower, but it gave you a sense of the relative importance. Having done that, we then used that as a basis for developing profiles of those facilities and systems based on public source data. I wanted to know at the time what the bad guys could find out. So we did that, and then we presented those profiles to the owners and operators of those facilities. to solicit their input as opposed to going to them and asking them to do the work. We kind of did the work for them and then said, okay, so what did we miss that's important? We're going to use this stuff in the State Emergency Operations Center if we ever have to respond to your facility, so what is it that we need to know? And it really helped open up a good dialogue with the private sector. As a result of that, we did it with some Homeland Security funds, and we were able then to use that to coordinate our efforts at a state level with the private sector so that we could lever our collective investments in a more organized manner. And finally, it was used to allocate some monies to local governments based on the concentrations of the critical infrastructures within their jurisdiction.
Well, thank you. At this point, we have no further questions. Again, we will be sending out links to the presentations and the webinar recording, so look forward to that. And Jeff Rellis, did you have any concluding comments?
Well, I do. Once again, thanks, and thanks to the participants for listening to the presentations, and of course, for the questions. The other, sort of wrap-up comment that I have is, we're going to go down this path, and it's important for us to get this right. So we really are interested in hearing, from legislators on what their risk assessment or risk analysis needs are, because that way we can sort of tailor the activity, tailor the results, the toolkit, the resource list, whatever it is, those things that are important to folks out there who do this, for a living. And we really want to make certain that we hear from them and get their input, because that's critical for what we're doing right now.
Well, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Briefly to that, and also how we can frame the questions. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, home heating cost in the state's gone up, $50 million. That's a bit of an abstraction, but you can say if the average homeowner is now bearing, this much more to heat their homes this winter because of the cold weather and the higher prices, it takes on a little bit different tone. And so if there's good ways that we can find to translate this information into information that is helpful in a decision-making process, that's something we also want to explore.
Well, thank you, and again, a big thanks to Alice Lippert and Jeff Pillen for taking the time to present and participate in the NCSL's webinar today. We also want to thank the attendees for logging in. And as I mentioned, we will be sending out a recording, and the presentation slides will be made available. So we look forward to interacting with you again on our next Energy Program webinar. Thanks.